Very excited to be here with Peter Davidson. We are going to talk today about data policy in the digital economy, and in that I think we're going to try to cover a pretty broad range of topics, including cybersecurity, what's happening in the world of trade today, trade generally, digital trade specifically. We may get to a couple other topics as well, but I want to introduce Peter first. So Peter Davidson is the General Counsel of the Department of Commerce. He is the second most senior political person at the Department of Commerce today. So Wilbur Ross is the Secretary of Commerce, and then Peter Davidson is the second person, the second most senior person. Peter has a long and illustrious career in Washington, D.C., working for the House Majority Leader. And one of the things that Peter and I have in common is that we both spent some time at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representatives, which are the President's trade negotiators. Peter was there in a political position, and I was there in a career position, but we worked very closely both through the General Counsel's office when Peter was General Counsel and my boss at USTR, and then later on when I was a negotiator at USTR. So he has a long, long history both on tech generally, but is a great expert on trade. So with that, Peter, I don't know if there's anything you want to say in terms of introduction, or I'll just jump right into questions.
I just want to say a word or two about Victoria, too. As many of you know Victoria, but she's done a great stint in intellectual property, pretty much all four corners. I actually hired Victoria in what year, 2001?
2001.
2001. I stole her from Covington and Burling in London and brought her over to USTR, and she hasn't looked back since then. She's done a terrific job. And the Obama administration is IP enforcement coordinator, and now at BSA. So it's a pleasure to be here with Victoria's as well. So hopefully we'll be able to pick your brain as much as you're picking mine on issues.
So yeah, as Peter mentioned, I've spent probably the bulk of my career in public service at this point at USTR, and then with President Obama as his advisor on intellectual property. But now I am CEO of BSA, the Software Alliance. We are a trade association. We represent the global software industry. And in addition to that, about 9 months ago, we just launched a new foundation called software.org, where we are working kind of the longer term economic and social impacts of software and technology today. So I'm fortunate in that I have a job that is interesting and challenging and different every day, which is also very much like being at the Department of Commerce. So I'll just start off with a very general question. The Department of Commerce famously does many different things. So this is a little bit of a tricky question, but how would you describe what the Department of Commerce does? And today, what is the department most focused on?
Yeah, so the department is, sounds like it's a little loud. Can you dial me down just a little bit? Thanks. The department is, in many ways, kind of an eclectic group of historically aligned agencies and departments. So it's everything from the Patent and Trademark Office. So I understand that our newly installed director of the Patent Office, Andre Iancu, is on another panel as we speak here. And I think he started at 4:30, so I think I can blow the news because I think he's already done it, but he was announcing the 10 millionth patent today, which is pretty cool. I was over there, and Victoria was there actually for Andre's swearing in too, and it's really neat. PTO is about over half of the employees of the Department of Commerce. They're spread out throughout the United States. Many of them they're all over the country, and many of them don't work in a traditional office. They're examiners, and they work from home, and they're just super smart engineers and other folks that, really more like tech sector, I think, than government employees. It's pretty interesting. And then you have NOAA, so you have weather and fish. You've got census. You've got trade in a bunch of different areas. You've got trade enforcement, and you've got trade negotiations, and you've got the national security export control issues. I've been involved lately in standing up Firstnet, which is the first responders network that's brand new. Congress allowed some money from a spectrum auction to be allocated to Firstnet in 2012 or 13. And there's about $7.5 billion now going into creating the first interoperable public safety network across the United States. So it's a very eclectic department. What's interesting, I think, in the space where we are here is that commerce, well, I guess 15, 20 years ago when we weren't really talking about digital economy issues, they really were just kind of an eclectic mix of different bureaus. But today, a good half of them actually come together in a fairly coherent working group of federal agencies dealing with digital economy issues. So NIST, which is, first of all, let me just ask the room here, and I just want to get a feel of kind of who's in the room. How many folks are government employees here? Okay. How many folks are private sector tech employees? Great. How about NGOs or think tanks? How about press? Perfect. Okay, good. No press, so I can say whatever I want. No. If you could only turn off the camera back there, then we could really have a good conversation. No, it's a very good mix in the room here. So I just want to know how detailed to get on things. But NIST is the National Institute of Science and Technology. NTIA, ITA, which is our trade organization. Yeah, woohoo. And they do a lot of work on the international data flows. So you've got, and I mentioned Firstnet that has some issues here as well, particularly in cybersecurity. So you've got a really interesting group that works well together. It wasn't planned that way. It's just that technology has come up to the point at which it actually works very well right now.
So coming into the Department of Commerce and faced with a giant department, how many thousands of people work?
About 50,000.
50,000 people at the Department of Commerce that cover a big range of issues. For you personally, what are the things that you're most interested in? What are your main priorities?
Well, I don't know what my personal priorities are. They kind of get subsumed by the priorities of the day. I've been spending a lot of time on steel and aluminum over the last, which isn't exactly the digital economy issues. But yeah, we've actually really my average day is I get sea lions eating endangered salmon in the Columbia River, and we got to figure out what do you do with the sea lions up there. I got mining on asteroids. I got property rights on the Titanic. And then and I got trade issues. I got Nafta renegotiation and everything that's involved with that. And then we have this digital economy issue. So it's really a very interesting mix of things, and they all pop up randomly, on a daily basis. So, but I really do enjoy this basket. If I could spend more time working on these issues, I really think it's important. One thing we didn't talk about that I did in my career as well, immediately before this, I worked for 14 years at Verizon Communications. And I learned a lot there about how it works from an infrastructure standpoint. So it's investment, what the motivations are for investing, cybersecurity issues from the private sector standpoint, how to design networks and things like that that are safe and that people want to participate and be a part of those networks. So I've kind of seen it from different angles now, and I just think it's a really fascinating basket of issues that's really, critical right now. I think just before I came out here, I was reading a couple speeches, and there was, I think, a new McKinsey report came out that said something like cross-border data flows have increased by 45% over the last 10 years, and now account for have accounted for a 10% increase in global GDP over that period of time. So probably not too surprising to people in the room because you all live this area, but really just incredible growth and incredible opportunities for people around the world to participate in the digital economy.
So speaking of critical issues, cybersecurity has been in the news a lot. There's the WannaCry attack, there was the Equifax breach. So there's, understandably, there's a lot of interest right now in cybersecurity. NIST, which is one of the agencies of the Department of Commerce, came out with a framework that has been very well received by U.S. stakeholders and by other countries. And in part, it's because the process that NIST went through to put that together was a long and very participatory one with lots and lots of input from different stakeholder groups. And they designed a framework that is has enough detail, I think, to give real guidance, but has enough flexibility. The NIST framework, the NIST framework is great. I think it's a model that others are looking to, but cybersecurity is also a quickly, rapidly evolving area. So my question to you is, in terms of cybersecurity generally, or NIST specifically, the cybersecurity framework, where do we go from here? Are there next steps? What else is the department looking at?
Yeah, I think, again, I kind of saw the development of the NIST cybersecurity framework from the other side, and I think there was a lot of trepidation about how this was going to be rolled out. There was, and I can tell you, discussions of the engineers and the folks designing networks were anticipating that anything government does is going to be mandatory and rigid, and it's going to be outdated in about 18 months, which that's probably a long cycle for some of the products that you all deal with. So I think people were really unsure, and there was a lot of pushback about doing it because I don't really know whether there are that many models that are, voluntary, flexible. I mean, can anybody think of something else in the federal government? I can't think of anything that comes to mind. So there was a lot of, fear going into it. I think it's been just a tremendous success. Everyone. I've had dozens of meetings on the topics, and now we're into this 1.1 revision that's going to be coming out shortly, and there's been, at least half a dozen workshops over the last year and a half, and I just think it gets really good reviews, and I think it does because it's flexible, it's voluntary, and it kind of can be adjusted to suit whatever your risk tolerances are, what specifically you're worried about in your cybersecurity profile. So it's very adjustable, and yet at the same time, it holds people to certain standards too. I think one of the things that is most important we think about in the cybersecurity framework going forward is a lot of the big companies and governments and folks are pretty dialed in on it right now, and I think they've got the resources and the expertise to deal with it. I think driving some of these practices down to medium-sized and smaller businesses is going to be a challenge because they don't have people dedicated to do this. It's expensive to figure out how to do it, but it really is a weak link in the chain, and as everything becomes more interconnected in our economy, the bad guys are going to go to those places where they can get in.
So you raise the fact that there may not be people enough to do it, and workforce is definitely, I think, a challenge in cybersecurity. There are other workforce issues as well, but in cybersecurity specifically, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that even inside the federal government, there aren't enough cybersecurity experts, that there's a workforce gap in the government, much less in companies outside the government. So I'd be interested in, is that an issue that the Department of Commerce is thinking about, or is the administration generally thinking about how to get more cybersecurity experts into the government?
Absolutely. It's probably one of the biggest challenges we have right now. Getting it's the whole supply chain, just to, not to make people be like products, but it's the supply chain of coming up with these cybersecurity experts. We don't have enough teachers teaching it. It's a lot of the same issues that Silicon Valley's, focusing on. It's not necessarily seen as an area that's open to minorities and women. I think there's a lot of things that we could do better, and the answer is we have been spending a lot of time on it. We actually have a report that's going to be coming out shortly that details some of the steps we need to take, both private and public sector, to deal with this. I think kind of using the framework as an example here, I think these are public and private sector problems that are kind of together, and there's some problems too, because what will happen is we get folks trained up that are cyber experts within the government, and they can get twice as much money on the outside, and so they spend 3 or 4 years on the inside doing a great job, become experts in what they're doing, and then all of a sudden they flip over to a company. There's not much you can do about that. I think government can think about ways, retention policies and paying people more and making sure that the jobs are rewarding so people stay. So there's a lot of things in the report that talk about that and what we can do to address the problem. I think, I know the private sector is having the same problem. The estimates I've seen are that we're probably about 2 million jobs that are unfilled worldwide right now. And in the United States, I think the estimate is about 300,000 jobs. And these are good jobs. I mean, these are, highly skilled, good paying, interesting jobs to be in. I think particularly in the public sector. My daughters are 24 and 21, and I'm going to help some of their friends find jobs and counsel their friends. And one of the areas I say is get into this area in cybersecurity. I think is if you have an inclination into engineering or computer science, or even if you don't, there's a lot of stuff that can be done on this. In the federal government, there are, probably 10 agencies that, well, every agency needs it, but there's probably 10 that actually have a mission dealing with cybersecurity.
So it would be great if we have time to come back to workforce development, because I think even beyond cybersecurity, there are a lot of workforce development issues. I think there's 1 million IT jobs by 2020 that we're not going to be graduating enough students to fill. So there's as everyone here probably knows, there's a huge gap. And one of the things that we've been really focused on is thinking about how do you fill that gap, and how do you fill that gap and try to make sure that as you're doing it, you're encouraging people from every walk of life, diversity and inclusion in every meaning of that word, including across the United States. So there's not just concentrated in certain parts of the country.
I want to add one thing to that as well, is that not only are we issuing the report, but we have a working group that's, the working group's called NICE, N-I-C-E, and I forget what the acronym stands for right now, but it is public and private sector NGOs working together to try to solve these problems. And it's actually a really effective working group, and they've been going on for quite some time now. So I think that they've been very helpful. The other group, I think, where there's a lot of potential is veterans. I think there's a natural interest in a lot of veterans in this area. Many of the attacks that we face are state-sponsored attacks. Some of them are just bad guys who almost have as much power as the state. I remember a couple years ago, I was in a meeting with a guy from the Secret Service who runs cybersecurity for the Secret Service. It's kind of interesting. The Secret Service does the monetary fraud, and FBI does everything else. And so the Secret Service guy told me that there's one super bad guy named Albert Gonzalez, who's, I think, behind bars now, claimed at one time to have access to three-quarters of the credit cards in the world. And the Secret Service said that's probably about right. So these guys are, even if they're not state-sponsored, and many of them are in Eastern Europe, associated with either the Ukraine or Russia or other places, they're very powerful people, almost more powerful than some state actors that are out there. So the threat is really across the map on this.
So let's talk a little bit about trade. There's been a lot of headlines about trade generally. Trade war has featured in many of those headlines prominently. We'll talk about digital trade, but maybe just take a moment and walk people through what has happened in the world of non-digital trade recently, just because we happen to be in this moment where there's a lot of discussion and activity in the trade world.
Right. So there have been, since the beginning of the administration, there have been a number of areas where, and the president has been very clear throughout the campaign and his time in office that his view is that we haven't been getting a fair shake on some of the trade deals that we've negotiated and the way that they're implemented and adjudicated internationally. And so he's changing the playing field, and he is taking some steps to put ourselves in a position to negotiate some better agreements. Now, initially, the first step was that he decided to withdraw from the TPP, and we can talk a little bit about that in a minute, because I think there's some aspects of the TPP that were problematic, and there's some aspects of the TPP that are pretty good, and the president has now kind of reopened the door to talking about TPP, which is an interesting development. We have the Nafta negotiations that have been going on for several rounds. I was in Ottawa a couple of them ago. I guess that would have been the third or the fourth round. I was going to go down to Mexico City, and then we had some of these other issues come up, so I wasn't able to go down there. And then I think we're going to be in Washington in a couple weeks. And a lot, it's interesting, a lot of those issues, and I spoke with some of the members of Congress that were down there observing in Mexico City. They came back very optimistic about progress that's being made. I think there are 3 or 4 issues that are going to be, what we call principles issues. So the autos rules of origin would be one of those. Maybe WTO dispute settlement. There's a couple of those that are going to have to be just decided by the ministers or above. But the other issues, there's probably 20 plus working groups, 25 working groups, and many of those are making a lot of progress and they're really finishing up. So a lot of the digital discussions, good government practices, anti-corruption. I've been working on a number of those, and they're going very well, and they really are modernizing NAFTA. I mean, even if you look at the rules of origin, when this is autos and it's not tech, so I don't mean to go on too long, but
maybe explain to people briefly what autos rules of
yeah,
origin is.
So there's going back to the original NAFTA, there's a list of, literally a list of parts they go through, and there's certain requirements about what percentage of cars be made, be from the one of the countries or from NAFTA countries as a whole, so that the idea is that you just won't get, whatever from China or Vietnam, 100% of the parts that are shipped into Mexico and assembled there and then shipped around to Mexico or to the United States and Canada. And so the United States has asked for a higher percentage of US parts in those cars and of NAFTA country parts as well. But a lot of that is really updating the rules of origin list so that, if you think of today, the car that you buy, all the technology's in there, not one piece of that technology was there when NAFTA was created. So the lists are very outdated, and the value of the car today is much more in the kind of technology line. So there's a lot of those kind of issues, but I actually think NAFTA is making some good progress. Now let me switch quickly to steel and aluminum. So because I think that's implicates what's going on with NAFTA a little bit as well. And I think everyone has seen that this has been a bit of a fluid process. I think the president has a goal of where he wants to get to, and he's open to how you get there. So he's basically said, we're going to exempt Canada and Mexico from these from the duties. We may exempt some others, but he wants to talk to them and see how we're going to reach our goals. Or many of them are mutual goals, but we'll work out a deal to get where we want to go. And so that's kind of the process we are in right now on steel and aluminum, and we'll see where it goes. Does it implicate some of the issues we're talking about here? I'm not sure that it really does. I think if NAFTA were to blow up, obviously, that wouldn't be good for some of the new economy issues that are in there. But I think for new trade agreements, and if we were to start talking about TPP again, the cross-border data flow language that was in TPP is, at the time it was the gold standard, and it's pretty good language. There's some things we could probably do to tweak it, but I think it's terrific language, and it would be very helpful for the digital economy to have those rules in place.
Right. So let's talk about that a little bit. So we have all of this emerging technology or existing technology, data analytics, blockchain, artificial intelligence, all of it dependent on data, cloud computing, all of it dependent on data being able to move with as little friction as possible, or as appropriately possible, across borders. But we have no international consensus on what those rules are, and we have no international framework at this point for countries to sign up to. So we have a very unpredictable situation where governments can make their own rules, and we can talk about some of the specific examples of when that's gone awry, or at least when it's been kind of on the brink of going awry in Europe and in China and other countries. TPP, as you said, was kind of was a start of doing that, of creating language that said the default rule is that data will move back and forth across borders. The default rule is that a government can't say you have to build your data center here in order to do business in that country. The default rule is that a government can't say you have to show me your source code in order to do business in my country. This administration withdrew from TPP. Recently, I think last week, the other 11 countries of TPP went ahead and signed TPP 11, as such it's called because it's 11 countries without the United States. Mm-hmm. And I think
it's kind of like it's like the Big Ten, right?
Okay,
You know, the numbers don't really mean that much anymore. So
they've largely left the rules, the digital trade rules, intact. But of course, the United States is not there, and the United States is a major or has been a major driver in all this. At the same time, you have NAFTA happening, where the United States is actively negotiating for rules on digital trade that potentially could build on TPP and even go beyond TPP. And my understanding, but you are closer to this than I am, is that those parts of the discussions are going well. That Canada, Mexico, and the United States are largely aligned on seeing their future being one of innovation, seeing the data economy as being important to the global economy. And while there are a lot of issues, and there are some issues in NAFTA that are more contentious, the issues around digital trade and trying to establish good precedents there are going well. But I'm not in the negotiations anymore.
No, I think
so I'd be interested in your thoughts.
I think your characterization is accurate. It's actually a good place to even expand on the TPP language, because I think we are very, simpatico on this issue, and the digital economy flowing in North America is very strong. So if you can push the envelope with countries that you agree with on this issue, then you actually create a platinum standard or whatever is the next above gold. And then you take that and shop it around. So my concept of this is that you develop in a couple different agreements the strongest language you can on cross-border data flows and other provisions that you mentioned. And then you insert that into the other agreements that you have. So if there are a number of other free trade agreements, FTAs, we have bilaterally negotiated with other countries, you can plug and place that language in each of those. And I think once countries get comfortable with that language, it becomes almost a term of art, and it's very easy to just cut it out and paste it and put it in another one. So, if we can get to that place, I think it would be a very good place. We're facing a lot of problems right now, and particularly, and this is, I think, where you were going, Victoria, is data localization requirements and other, tech transfer requirements that really hurt American businesses in particular, because we're leaders in this space. So if somebody wants to give their time, it's the old infant industry argument. They want to give their tech companies some time to catch up to American companies. They have data localization requirements. When we were at USTR, it was probably more like the sanitary and phytosanitary rules. So they'd come up with reasons why some of our food isn't safe or something, and then they'd keep it out. Well, they're protecting their industries, and that was fairly, easy to tell protectionism. This is disguised a little bit because there are legitimate privacy and cybersecurity issues, but those legitimate issues are sometimes being taken as excuses to protect their industries, and saying you have to have, you can only use the German cloud, not to pick on Germany, but you can't have your own cloud. I don't even know what that means, but your own cloud in Germany, you've got to use our cloud. So have your servers located there, whatever it is. And, it's a lot easier to fight those things by getting the strong language in a trade agreement up front before they kind of get entrenched in practice.
So you mentioned Germany. Let's talk a little bit about Europe and what's going on there. There was, over 15 years ago, there was an agreement that was negotiated between the United States and the European Commission that set rules that let data move back and forth between the United States and Europe under certain circumstances. And about a year and a half ago now, the European Court of Justice revoked that agreement. They said it was unconstitutional under the European Constitution because of American practices, largely because of the American surveillance regime. And so so they revoked the safe harbor, and they said it no longer applies. Now, Peter knows, but many people don't know, that the US and the Europeans had actually already been discussing a new agreement for many years, because it had been 15 years since it was negotiated. It was sort of clear to everyone, certainly to the tech industry, that a lot had changed in 15 years and there needed to be a new agreement. So those negotiations were already happening, but when the European Court of Justice revoked it, it sort of turbocharged the negotiations, and there became a lot of focus on trying to move them forward as quickly as possible. And in a few months, at the very beginning of February of 2017, the United States and the Europeans reached an agreement, which is now referred to as the Privacy Shield. The Privacy Shield has been in place now for over a year. It's one of the parts of the new agreement was that every year the United States and Europe would review it and see whether or not there needed to be changes. So there wouldn't be another long period of time that went by without it being updated. It's gone through one review. I think most people felt like the first year review was more a chance to see how it was operating. But now it will be coming up for a second review. And in fact, Commissioner Jourova, who is the head of the Department of Justice, essentially, in the European Commission, is going to be in Washington in a couple of weeks, in part, to talk about the Privacy Shield. So I'd be interested in telling us what's going on in terms of the Privacy Shield from inside the government. How are the discussions going with the Europeans?
Yeah, I think you summarized it very well. I think we finished our first annual review of the Privacy Shield. I think it was October, November. I can't remember when Commissioner Jourova was over. She met with Secretary of Commerce. We had multiple meetings. They had a big forum with FTC. Chairwoman Olhausen was there. Secretary Ross kicked it off. I think it went very well. And overall, we're working closely with the Europeans because it's in our mutual interest to make this work. I mean, there are, I don't know, $1 trillion of information going across our borders. And so much of the digital economy depends on the data flows. It's a little bit of the concept is not as easy to grasp as widgets moving across borders to, create machines and cars, but it's really exactly the same. And if this doesn't work out, and we have 2 cases right now that are coming to the European Court of Justice, one is a reexamination of the Privacy Shield itself, and the other is a case that's dealing with a related regime. It's called model contracts that big companies usually enter into that kind of approximate the same Privacy Shield. And there's 2 cases, and the problem is that both of these cases are basically constitutional rulings, so the legislatures can't go back in and fix them necessarily. I mean, you'd have to do Privacy Shield 3, and I'm not quite sure how much room there would be to negotiate that. And if they make a very broad ruling that the practices are unconstitutional from a privacy standpoint, it would be very tough. So we've been working closely with the member states and Commissioner Jourova to make sure that everyone is holding hands and working together to make sure that we have the right components here and we have the right components over there as well so that both systems mesh.
I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions, but so one final question from me before I turn it over to the audience. Now, we've talked about NAFTA and the conversations that are going on in digital trade and data policy between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We've talked about Europe and the conversations that are going on right now between the US administration and the European Commission. It's a big world out there, and data needs to move around the entire world. Are there any other countries or regions of the world that you'd want to call out where there's a lot of discussion going on between the administration in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. Really good story to tell in APEC. The similar type of agreement is been out there, kind of negotiated, multi-stakeholder discussions, a lot of negotiations between the states, and we now have a framework up there for cross-border privacy rules, CBPR, as a part of an APEC construct. I think that we have 6 out of the 21 countries are formally signed up right now. Probably have about half a dozen others that are about to sign up. And we're very optimistic that this will become like a Privacy Shield type agreement within APEC. So that would be a huge development. And then the next step would be marrying up the world, basically taking the Privacy Shield and the CBPR in APEC and having everyone recognize each other's regimes as maybe not the same. They don't look the same. They may not be in one coherent statute, but the effect of those are protecting data privacy and, at least to a certain standard. And that would be huge because I think for data moving around the world at that point, that makes everybody's, at least there's a mechanism for redress, and there's people that are watching what's going on. And as Maureen Olhausen said in this event, if you sign up for the Privacy Shield and you aren't doing what you said you were going to do, you American companies, we're going to come after you and hold you accountable because we don't want one bad actor to blow up, be the poster child. Now, I don't know that I do not believe that there has been a complaint lodged yet under Privacy Shield by an individual saying that their data has been compromised improperly. So there's not a huge demonstrated problem right now. It's just making sure that the mechanisms are in place. Congress passed a law a Congress ago dealing with judicial redress. We are putting the right people in the right places in the administration to make sure that the agreement on the Privacy Shield is in place. I know Adam Klein, who is just got out of committee, has been nominated to be the chairman of the P Club. There were
the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board.
Right. So he'll be moving. All he needs to do is get a vote in the Senate, and he'll be into the position as chairman. And then there are several others in the pipeline for P Club, so they'll have an operating quorum shortly, and that's an important part as well. So I feel very confident that we're living up to our side of the Privacy Shield, and I feel that we'll have a good visit for Commissioner Jourova. We got a good story to tell when she comes over in about a week and a half.
So as you were talking, that actually made me think of another question related to Brexit, but I know that we're starting to run out of time, so I do want to give the audience a chance to ask questions if there are any questions. Great, I see 4. So I'm going to go to you first. Would you mind saying your name and where you're from?
No, not at all. My name is Brian McGinnis from Indianapolis, debt privacy attorney at the largest law firm. We have a number of clients that are applying for transfer mechanism. You mentioned the 2 cases that are pending regarding that. What's a contingency plan in the event that one of those cases invalidates privacy shield along the same lines as safe harbor?
It's a good question. The question is what's the contingency plan if these little nuclear bombs go off? Well, it would depend on what the breadth of the ruling would be. So if it's a narrow ruling so it's procedural or if it's fixable, then I think the contingency plan would be to fix it, renegotiate that provision, or just see what we can do with that. If it's a very broad ruling, in either of the 2 cases, I think that's very problematic because it's not clear where you go from there. I mean, just think of it in our own context of a constitutional problem. If you'd have to go back and amend the Constitution or whatever you do. So it's difficult. It's why we've really been working hard to get the member states to weigh in the equivalent of amicus briefs in these cases. And we've tried, again, to have this kind of across the Atlantic holding of hands to say this is too important, we need to fix this. It's underlying a lot of the economy across the Atlantic.
Probably worth mentioning, since you mentioned the equivalent of amicus briefs, my organization has the European Court of Justice has invited us into one of those cases to essentially be like an expert amicus. And part of what we're doing there is demonstrating what the economic impact would be if the model contract clauses, which is the technical term in this case, if they were struck down by the European Court of Justice. Great question. Another question?
Hi, I'm Alex Baden. I'm the founder of a RegTech company based in New Jersey. My question is about another acronym, GDPR. Which we see a lot of US-based companies getting very spun up about maybe fast approaching. In our experience, a lot of them aren't really sure what it means for them. My question, I guess, is about enforcement and whether there's any kind of coordination or at least communication plan with question in there somewhere. It's, where would you direct us from in the U.S. to look at with our government to get guidance and direction on how to get compliant and then what the future may lie?
Yeah, so we're having a lot of conversations about that. This is all part of one big basket, all of these things, and I feel pretty good about the relationship. It's not adversarial at all. It's working with
The relationship with Europe.
the relationship with Europe is not. I mean, listen, when I say Europe, of course there are parties in Europe that would like to blow the whole thing up, and then there are, what I'm talking about is the Commission and the folks that we're dealing with. They have their representative duties that they're doing, and they're doing that well and serving their constituents. On the other hand, they understand the importance of this relationship economically, and not just with the United States, but the rest of the world. And so I think it's a very good working relationship. We're trying to get them what they need in our system, and they're working with us to tell us that. So in terms of the mechanism that you would interact with, the Commerce Department is available to do this. We're the point on a lot of these issues, and Jim Sullivan, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Services Issues, is the point on this. And if you're looking for a name, Jim is the guy to talk to. He's got a great team that I've been working with very closely over the last several months on this, and particularly in preparing for the visit with Commissioner Jourová, and all of these issues will be on the table. They're going to be here. They're going to be here. I mean, not in Austin. They're going to be in D.C. For a good week, and then we kick off the U.S. tour of Privacy Shield. So we'll be going to different places, and Jim and his team have the dates where they're going to be doing workshops around the country. I don't know that it's published yet. I know that there's half a dozen stops they're going to do, and we're doing them jointly. So maybe half a dozen, maybe too many, 4 to 6, I think, and we'll be making those available. I think.
I'm sure they will be published.
Yeah, I'm sure
as many people to come in as
it's coming up, so it probably is. Yeah, and you can just check the website. It'd be the ITA website, and then services button.
I'm going to go to you and then you.
So there's 2 topics that I was living in mortal fear that somebody would ask me about. One was blockchain, and the other was quantum. And they're both way above my pay grade. I'm honestly.
I have views on both, and I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Victoria. I think we just did have a hearing on some of these issues, and Chuck Bromine from NIST testified a couple weeks ago on some of the issues you addressed. So I'd probably direct you, and he touched on many of those issues too. I think it was in the House. Can't remember what committee it was. It might have been the Science Committee had the hearing. So I'd direct you to that, and then I will refer you to Victoria. So
I think your question in essence was, how is blockchain and government, how are they going to work together? And I would say, so I've heard a lot of people saying that blockchain is going to be the death of government, these very dramatic statements. And I will tell you, I completely reject that. In fact, I think blockchain is actually going to be immensely beneficial to government in a few ways, but I think one of the ways I'll focus on is I think there are a lot of government resources that are appropriately spent on trying to deliver services to citizens, but they are not done. I think everyone probably agree with this. It's not done in a way that is as efficient and as customer friendly as it could be. I mean, I assume if I ask this room how many people in this room feel like you consistently have excellent customer service as you're dealing with the government-based services. Is there anyone willing to put up their hand and say, right? And I won't kind of go down the scale. I've done that in other rooms, and it's a pretty consistent reaction. But I think one of the things that blockchain can do is, at least in some areas, I think it can really help with the government efficiency of service, and so that government can do what it's supposed to do as well as it can be. And what I would define what government is supposed to be doing is serving the citizens. I'm going to give a very specific example of that. And this is, as far as I know, not something the government of India is planning to do, although the government of India is very actively looking at how to use blockchain in its financial services sector. But an example in India, and one that I think is being actually used in some US states, I think Illinois, and I think is being looked at in Ghana, has to do with land title. And I mention India because one of the problems that India, or a challenge that India faces, is the fact that its judicial system is very, very difficult to use. And part of the reason is because its judicial system is completely choked with litigation over land titles. I think like 80% of the civil docket in India is litigation over land titles. And an example of how blockchain can be used in government services is put registries of land titles that will be not subject to corruption because they can't be tampered with, and that will be much more permanent and accessible for people, both for individuals and for citizens, and for the government employees who need to be able to access to them. So I'm hopeful at some point the government of India will take that up. I know already that Ghana is looking at that, and certain states in the United States, and there are probably other governments as well. There's actually a whole list of ways in which governments are starting to think about using blockchain in terms of digital services, but I'm going to focus on land title just because I think that is one where there's so much promise in the sort of, in the now or in the immediate future. But I will also go on record as saying I actually think blockchain will be the savior of government. I do not think it will be the death of government in any way.
It's a really interesting question. There was a bill in Congress a couple years ago, and it had to deal, and there's been a little debate around this in particular, on the information that comes from automobiles. So there's the black box in a car that has all kinds of data stuff that you can, it's kind of like the black box in airplanes, and it stores and sends out some data. And then that's been around for a while, but now the cars are sending out all kinds of information, and they're storing your data. And so who owns that data? So does the car company own the data? Do you own the data? And there was a bill was dropped that basically said that the old black box stuff was owned by the customer. And it kind of set off this whole discussion about, okay, who does really own this stuff? So I think the answer to your question is yes, this is gonna be a big discussion in the United States and in Europe. And I don't think there's a clear answer. I think you have to actually look at the applications and look what the expectations are of the consumers, and look what the contractual arrangements are with whoever it is, whether it's a car company or the consumer. I think you can contract around things. The Europeans are probably less likely to agree you can contract around things if you want. But if it's a fair deal, I think it's kind of like getting free web searches, but you have to look at ads. There's going to be some deals that are worked out in terms of this, so it's an interesting question. And I have a question for you. I don't know if there's been any news lately, but I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan, so I just want to know what the deal with Kirk Cousins is. Has there been any, do you have any inside information on the?
No, I actually don't.
I thought you were going to say that, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so final question.
Yeah, hi. My name is Keith. I'm with the Norwegian Business Association, and my responsibility there is IT policy. So the whole GDPR aspect is quite relevant for us. But I want to kind of jump back to the data flow issue there, and because as I saw it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the reason that safe harbor fell and the individual shreds, the aspect he pointed out there was basically that the U.S. didn't fulfill its part of the agreement. So
Right.
it was basically kind of the lack of distrust aspect of it. So the agreement fell. And the new agreement with Privacy Shield, it also has a trust aspect to it because basically the agreement has to be fulfilled. And we also see that Trent has a long list of things he views as weaknesses in this. And since the last agreement, the Trump administration has gone on as well. And so with these two cases pending, I'm very curious about your thoughts on kind of how is the climate now and kind of how do you see the dialogue on the potential new agreement compared to the previous time?
Yeah, I know I'm very optimistic. I mean, I think that the discussions are very positive. We're on the same page. We've got homework that we got to get done. We do have some. We are compliant with the agreement, and I think that as soon as we take some steps like getting more of the P Club members on board, that's really important. I actually had met with Adam Klein. I'd not met him before. Terrific guy. He's going to be a great chair. Very energetic. He gets the mission. I think, I'm hoping that he'll be confirmed in time to meet with Commissioner Jourova when they come over, because I think that would be a really good meeting. Very closely coordinate with the State Department. Been talking with a former colleague of mine at the Justice Department, is the Deputy Secretary of State now, John Sullivan's a great guy, is very aware of this issue. And Secretary Tillerson takes it very seriously. Secretary Ross, when he met with Commissioner Jourova in the fall, could not have been stronger about U.S. commitment to the Privacy Shield. And I think it was well received by the members that we met with. So I'm very optimistic that both sides want to make this work. And it's kind of like the NIST framework. We've got to keep revising it and making sure that it's up to date and that people are confident. This is not just an international issue, but trust in the sector from users is so important. So whether it's cybersecurity or Privacy Shield, if we're going to take advantage of the great things that these networks and this digital economy can bring to people, it really is, whether you're talking about blockchain or all the other things, we're solving some of the most difficult problems in society. But that really starts to come apart if you're not trusting the networks and the services and the people that are behind them. So really getting that element of trust, even outside the legal context. If you're just a business person trying to make money on building networks or selling software or doing whatever, it should be in your interest to double down on security and making sure that customers and people using the internet and using the worldwide networks feel like they're protected and there's somebody there looking after their privacy. So there's some different perceptions about how much privacy protection we need, but I think if we kind of all agree that it's in everybody's interest to make sure that users feel that their privacy is secure, that's going to be good for everybody. And that's where we are with the Europeans, and that's where we are with the APEC negotiations. That's all, I think it's all very positive. We got to get past these two cases. And I'm not as much of an expert on how that works, but I think demonstrating to the court that everyone believes that this is a workable system that has strong privacy protections is a very good step toward getting some good, getting the right result in those cases.
Well, I think the importance of trust is a great note to end on. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you, Victoria.
Okay.